On the night of November 3, 2018, emergency crews were dispatched to the upscale neighborhood of Stonebridge Falls, Virginia, after reports of a sudden explosion and fire ripping through the home of Julian and Marissa Hale. What appeared to neighbors as a tragic household accident quickly revealed itself as something far darker. Inside the blackened shell of the living room, firefighters discovered Marissa's body. The fire hadn't killed her. She had been struck with brutal force to the head before the blaze was set. The accelerant splashed across the carpet. The strategically placed ignition points and the shattered fuel can left behind told investigators everything they needed to know. The fire wasn't an accident. It was staged. A's detectives secured the scene. Suspicion quickly narrowed. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of burglary, no intruder slipping away into the night. Instead, every trace pointed inward. To the man who should have been Marissa's protector, her husband, Julian Hale. What investigators would uncover in the weeks ahead shocked Stonebridge Falls to its core. A hidden financial collapse, secret affairs, and a revenge plan so precise it had been building for months. By the time it was exposed, the damage was irreversible. This wasn't the story of a failing marriage. It was the story of a husband's calculated plan for revenge. And the moment his double life finally came crashing down. Stonebridge Falls was a wealthy suburban enclave just outside Washington, D.C., a place where families built reputations on appearances. The neighborhood was filled with manicured lawns, sprawling homes, and residents who prided themselves on success and stability. Crime was rare, and any disruption to the quiet order of life was quickly noticed. Julian Hale, 42, fit seamlessly into that environment. To outsiders, he was a polished entrepreneur who ran a mid-sized investment consultancy. He attended charity galas, played golf with business associates, and gave the impression of a man who had built his life carefully and securely. His wife, Marissa Hale, 38, was a pediatric nurse admired by colleagues and well-liked in the community. Friends described her as generous, dependable, and the steady balance to Julian's ambition. The couple lived in a 3-story brick colonial home near the center of Stonebridge Falls. From the outside, they seemed like a model family. Successful, careers, financial comfort, and an active role in the community. But behind closed doors, the picture was far different. Debt, suspicion, and resentment had begun to erode their marriage, creating fractures invisible to their neighbors. Those fractures would soon become the foundation of a deadly plan, one that investigators would only piece together after it was too late. On the evening of November 3, 2018, the Hale residence in Stonebridge Falls appeared quiet from the outside. Neighbors later recalled that nothing seemed unusual until just after 11 p.m., when a loud crack echoed through the street, followed by flames rising from the living room windows. Several residents rushed out, dialing 911 as smoke filled the night air. When firefighters forced their way inside, they quickly realized the fire wasn't spreading naturally. Pockets of accelerant had been poured in deliberate spots, creating isolated blazes designed to mimic an accidental ignition. At the center of the destruction lay the body of Marissa Hale, collapsed near the edge of the living room. She bore a deep wound to the head, consistent with blunt force trauma. The coroner would later confirm she was dead before the fire began. Investigators noted strange details almost immediately. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the kitchen counter, alongside another glass that had been hastily rinsed but still bore traces of lipstick. Upstairs, nothing was disturbed. Valuables, jewelry, and electronics remained untouched. The first interviews with neighbors provided a troubling timeline. Several recalled seeing Julian Hale's black SUV parked in the driveway at around 10:30 p.m., despite his claim that he had left earlier in the evening for a business dinner in downtown D.C. Security cameras from a nearby home corroborated this, capturing his vehicle returning to the neighborhood just after 9:45 p.m. and remaining there until minutes before the fire erupted. Arson specialists quickly determined the blaze was staged to cover evidence. Traces of gasoline were recovered from broken glass found near Marissa's body. The ignition point suggested a quick attempt to obscure the true cause of death. For detectives, the implication was clear. Whoever killed Marissa had also tried to erase their tracks. Suspicion turned almost immediately to Julian. While outwardly calm during questioning, his story showed inconsistencies. He claimed he had left the house by 8:30 p.m., yet phone records placed his cell near Stonebridge Falls well past 10 o'clock. He insisted he had been in constant contact with business partners that evening, but investigators discovered that several calls on his log were never answered. Even more telling was his demeanor at the scene. Witnesses later described him as strangely detached, standing apart from the crowd of neighbors as firefighters worked to control the blaze. One officer noted he didn't ask about Marissa's condition until nearly half an hour after arriving. When it was already clear she hadn't survived. The following morning, a search warrant was executed on the home once the fire was fully extinguished. In the garage, police recovered a pair of Julian's work gloves that tested positive for traces of both gasoline and Marissa's blood. In a trash bin outside the house, investigators found a partially burned rag soaked with accelerant. The items placed Julian squarely in the focus of the investigation. The autopsy on Marissa revealed devastating results. She had been struck at least twice on the head with a heavy object, likely a blunt tool or weapon later removed from the scene. There were no defensive wounds on her arms, suggesting she may have been caught off guard or incapacitated before the attack. Toxicology screens found no drugs or alcohol in her system, ruling out impairment. By the end of the week, the case had shifted from a fire investigation to a homicide inquiry. Evidence indicated planning, staging, and intent. The crime was not random, and the absence of forced entry narrowed the suspect list to someone Marissa knew and trusted. For detectives, all signs pointed toward her husband, Julian Hale. But as they dug deeper, they would uncover that the murder was not just an act of violence. It was the execution of a plan rooted in revenge, built over months and carried out with calculated precision. Detective Aaron Maddox began the investigation with a focus on the inconsistencies in Julian Hale's story. His claim of being at a business dinner in downtown Washington did not align with the evidence collected at the scene. Phone records quickly became the first crack in his alibi. Analysis showed his device had pinged off cell towers in Stonebridge Falls during the exact time frame he claimed to be away. Even more suspicious was a 30-minute gap when his phone had been powered off, aligning with the medical examiner's estimate of Marissa's time of death. The forensic sweep of the Hale residence revealed details that could not be ignored. Accelerant had been poured in deliberate locations, and the ignition points indicated a staged fire. The work gloves found in the garage bore both gasoline residue and traces of Marissa's blood. In the trunk of Julian's SUV, investigators uncovered faint blood smears beneath the carpet lining. DNA confirmed they belonged to Marissa. Carpet fibers from the living room were also recovered, tying the vehicle directly to the crime. The autopsy results strengthened the case further. Marissa had been struck on the head at least twice with a blunt object. A household hammer later discovered in a utility closet was identified as the likely weapon. Though it had been wiped down, forensic testing revealed microscopic traces of her blood and hair. The lack of defensive wounds on her arms suggested she had been caught off guard, either attacked suddenly or incapacitated before she could resist. Digital forensics provided another damning layer. On Julian's laptop, investigators recovered deleted search queries related to fire accelerants, methods of causing head trauma, and how to maximize insurance payouts after a fire. These were not random searches. They formed a pattern of planning that prosecutors would later argue showed clear premeditation. Financial records exposed the motive. Julian's consulting firm had been in decline for 2 years, and his personal debts exceeded $250,000. Credit card statements revealed gambling losses, cash advances, and transfers to outside accounts. Meanwhile, Marissa's life insurance policy, worth nearly $1 million, named Julian as the sole beneficiary. Detectives also learned that Marissa had quietly begun preparing for divorce. Draft papers were found on her computer, and her colleagues confirmed she had spoken about leaving Julian in the weeks before her death. Had she filed, Julian's financial lifeline would have been cut off. Witness accounts helped reconstruct the timeline. A neighbor walking their dog heard two sharp thuds around 10:30 p.m., consistent with the blows to Marissa's head. Another neighbor saw Julian's SUV leaving the driveway just before the fire became visible. Surveillance footage from a convenience store 2 miles away placed him there at 11:20 p.m., buying water. Detectives believed the stop was intentional, a calculated attempt to create an alibi by placing himself in public shortly after the crime. Piece by piece, the evidence dismantled. Julian's story, his phone data, the physical evidence in his home and vehicle, the autopsy, and the financial motive all converged into a clear narrative. The murder had not been an accident, nor had it been impulsive. It was planned, executed, and disguised as a tragic house fire. By mid-December 2018, Detective Maddox had assembled a case strong enough to secure an arrest. Julian Hale was taken into custody at his office in Stonebridge Falls. Outwardly calm and composed, he offered no resistance as he was escorted out in handcuffs. But for investigators, the work was not over. As they dug further into his finances and personal life, they uncovered even deeper secrets. Details that revealed the crime was not just about desperation, but about revenge, carefully plotted and concealed. Julian Hale's arrest seemed like the closing chapter of the case, but investigators quickly discovered they had only begun to understand the full scope of his plan. As prosecutors prepared for trial, new evidence surfaced that reshaped the narrative and revealed the crime to be even more deliberate than initially believed. Forensic accountants digging through Hale's financial records uncovered a series of hidden transfers to an out-of-state account. At first, the transactions appeared to be routine business activity, but the account holder was soon identified as Lena Warren, a woman who had once worked with Julian years earlier. She was not just a colleague, she was a long-term mistress, and records showed he had funneled more than $40,000 to her in the year before Marissa's murder. The payments included hotel bookings, luxury purchases, and cash withdrawals that Julian had disguised as business expenses. The revelation reframed the motive. What had first appeared to be a desperate attempt to collect life insurance was now tied to a double life. Julian was planning not only financial escape but a new future with someone else. Marissa's looming divorce would have destroyed those plans, exposing his debt, his infidelity, and his deception. The second shock came from storage unit investigators, discovered registered under one of Julian's shell accounts. Inside, they found items that could only be described as a blueprint for the crime. There were spare work gloves stained with gasoline, clothing bearing faint blood traces, and handwritten notes mapping out the sequence of events. Among them were chilling phrases: cover injury with fire, dispose of weapon, and make presence public. The notes revealed that Julian had rehearsed the crime step by step. It was not a sudden act of rage, but a meticulously organized plan. Further examination of Julian's devices exposed another layer. Deleted but recovered internet searches showed he had been researching the timeline of fire investigations, how long accelerant traces last, and common mistakes made by arsonists. In one search, he asked whether blunt force trauma could be mistaken for fire-related injuries. These findings confirmed what investigators already suspected, that the fire was never intended to kill Marissa. It was a tool to conceal the true manner of her death. Perhaps the most damning revelation came from Lena Warren herself. When subpoenaed, she admitted that Julian had spoken repeatedly about ending his marriage, not through divorce, but through what he described as a clean break. She insisted she never believed he was serious, but her testimony confirmed that Julian had verbalized the intent to remove Marissa long before the murder took place. As the case files expanded, another discovery deepened the sense of calculation. Less than a month before the murder, Julian had increased Marissa's life insurance coverage by an additional $500,000. The paperwork was completed quickly, with Julian listed as the sole beneficiary. Investigators concluded that this policy adjustment was not coincidental. It was part of his final preparations, ensuring maximum payout once his plan was complete. The weight of these revelations changed the community's perception entirely. The murder was no longer seen as a domestic tragedy driven by financial stress. It was now understood as a carefully engineered act of revenge, plotted by a man who wanted to erase his wife while constructing a new life elsewhere. The betrayal extended beyond Marissa. Friends, neighbors, and business associates realized Julian had been living a facade, hiding a collapsing empire and an affair that had gone on for years. For prosecutors, the new evidence eliminated any possibility of presenting the crime as impulsive. The handwritten notes, the staged fire, the financial maneuvers, and the mistress's testimony combined into a narrative of cold, deliberate intent. Julian had not lost control. He had taken control, planning every step until the very end. By the time the pretrial hearings began, the picture was complete. Julian Hale was not simply a man who killed his wife. He was a man who spent months designing her death, ensuring that when the plan unfolded, it would look like an accident. But when his plan for revenge was finally exposed, it was already too late for Marissa, for the life they once shared, and for the image Julian had spent years projecting to the world. The trial of Julian Hale began in the spring of 2020 inside the Fairfax County Courthouse. By the time jury selection was completed, the case had drawn widespread media attention. What had once been whispered rumors in Stonebridge Falls became headline news across Virginia. Prosecutors entered the courtroom with a case they described as airtight. They presented the timeline first, showing Julian's phone records, vehicle movements, and the gap when his phone had been shut off, coinciding with the moment Marissa was attacked. The jury saw surveillance footage of his SUV returning to the neighborhood that night and leaving just before the fire was reported. The forensic evidence followed. Investigators testified about the accelerant patterns in the living room, the gloves from Julian's garage, and the hammer found inside the house. Blood, fibers, and accelerant traces tied every piece back to him. The medical examiner confirmed Marissa had been struck twice in the head and was dead before the fire ever started. The fire, they argued, was nothing more than a cover dash up. Digital. Analysts introduced the most chilling details. They described Julian's deleted internet searches and showed the jury fragments of handwritten notes from the storage unit outlining his step-by-step plan. Combined with testimony from forensic accountants about his mounting debts and the increased life insurance policy, the prosecution painted a clear picture of motive and premeditation. The testimony of Lena Warren added the human element to the prosecution's case. She acknowledged her affair with Julian and admitted he had spoken of wanting a clean break. Though she insisted she never thought he would act on it, her presence confirmed to the jury that Julian had been planning a new life without Marissa. Funded by her death, the defense attempted to counter by portraying Julian as a man crushed under financial pressure. They argued the searches and notes were the ramblings of someone contemplating scenarios, not a blueprint for murder. They tried to suggest that Lena's testimony was unreliable, motivated by her own guilt. But with each argument, prosecutors returned to the physical evidence. The gloves, the hammer, the staged fire, the financial transfers. The trial lasted 5 weeks. Dozens of witnesses testified, from forensic experts to neighbors who had seen Julian's SUV that night. Jurors were shown photographs of the crime scene and the storage unit, leaving little room for doubt about the level of planning involved. When closing arguments began, the prosecution described Julian as a man who had carefully engineered his wife's death for money and for freedom, presenting himself publicly as a devoted husband while secretly constructing her demise. The defense asked the jury to consider reasonable doubt, but their case was overshadowed by the weight of evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On May 14, 2020, they returned a unanimous verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder, arson, and insurance fraud. At sentencing, the judge addressed Julian directly, stating that the crime was one of the most calculated acts of betrayal the court had ever seen. Julian Hale was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict closed the case in the legal sense, but for Stonebridge Falls, the damage remained. Friends who once admired Julian as a successful businessman now remembered him as a murderer who had destroyed the very life he was meant to protect. For Marissa's family, the trial brought justice, but not healing. The details revealed in court underscored just how deliberate her death had been, leaving scars that could not be erased. Julian was led from the courtroom in shackles, expressionless. His plan for revenge, meticulously crafted and staged, had been exposed in full. But by then, the truth had come too late for Marissa Hale, and the betrayal had already destroyed everything. The story of Julian and Marissa Hale is remembered in Stonebridge Falls not only for its brutality, but for the cold precision with which it was carried out. What appeared to be a successful marriage hid years of financial deception, secret relationships, and growing resentment. When Julian's plan for revenge was finally exposed, it revealed not a moment of anger but a crime calculated down to the smallest detail. Marissa's death was staged to look like an accident, but the evidence stripped away every layer of Julian's disguise. His debts, his affair, his internet searches, and his handwritten notes turned the image of a devoted husband into that of a man who saw murder as a solution. The life insurance policy, the staged fire, and the alibi attempt showed how far he was willing to go to control the outcome. For the community, the trial closed one chapter but left questions that lingered long after the sentencing. How could a man so respected by neighbors and friends carry such a secret double life? And how many other betrayals remain hidden, waiting to surface only after tragedy strikes? Julian Hale will spend the rest of his life in prison, his reputation destroyed, and his freedom gone. But the true cost of his actions will always be measured in the life he ended, the trust he shattered, and the reminder that even within the walls of a family home, danger can be hiding in plain sight.